Good evening, ghouls and spooky people. Today is Spooktober, and in honor of this month of nothing but memes, I decided to dive into the scariest thing you can possibly imagine. Academic discourse. Hold on to your courage, you're gonna need it to handle this tale of fear and woe. Ludology is the study of play. Easy. Fire your schools and your teachers. I am your learning center. Narratology is the logi of narratives, and back in the early 2000s there was a really serious, bloodthirsty culture war between these people called narratologists who wanted to study art for its cultural value and for its storytelling ability, and people who believed that games were just the sum of their parts, and to read any sort of narrative into the game would be an act of treason. Those people were called ludologists. There's a video over on Errant Signal about this period in the history of academia. You should go and subscribe and watch Chris's videos, even though I'm about to explain why I disagree with this one that he did 5 years ago. Disagreement's healthy. I just hate you now, Chris. So according to Chris, the debate never really happened. There were some scholars who were like, we need tools in our toolbox that are specific to our discipline, and we can't just keep taking things from literary studies and sociology and psychology. We gotta do our own thing. And Chris says that this idea about crafting a more specialized form of talk about games suffused past academics via their blogs and things like that. From there, he says that people who already believe that games should only be focused on for their mechanics got kind of carried away and used these blog posts as validation for their beliefs. They heard these rumblings from the Discourse and then kind of got this idea into their heads that ludology was about fucking throwing away narratives. Stories are bad, and you're bad if you put stories in video games. It's not about that! The end result, according to Chris, was a division between gameplay and story in modern and popular game criticism. He thinks that ludonarrative dissonance is a term that exemplifies that division. He says we would never talk about the way that cinematography and narrative in film clash, so why would we do it with video games? And Dan Olson, over on Folding Ideas, already has like a good video rebutting that specific claim. He explains that it's actually okay and productive and normal to talk about the way that the different composite parts of a movie can actually clash, and so too can we do that with games, and it's all fine. My super serious complaint isn't about that though. It's about this idea that this debate never actually happened, because it kinda did, and I would argue it's still going on to this day. This point in history wasn't merely a case of garbled communication through the grapevine from the ivory tower to everybody else, and to say so is to give academics a little too much credit. One of the most eminent and influential ludologists in the world, Jesper Juul, wrote his 2001 master's thesis, as if you have a different thesis for every year. And he said things like, games are different than narratives because we already know the ending. Can anyone think of a notable game which had an ending that rocked the gaming world? Here, I'll give you a hint. It's widely considered to be the first gender reveal party. It was also a thing that changed the way that we can perceive and think about video game endings and what it means to finish a video game. More story equals present for Game Boy? You can beat Metroid without seeing the ending where Samus takes off her helmet, but if you're not seeing her nearly naked body, then are you really seeing the ending of the game? I wasn't around in the 80s, but I hear it was a really big shocker too. Most people weren't expecting that. So I don't understand how you could possibly say that nobody has a desire to see the ending of a game because the ending is known. It seems to me that this argument is predicated on this idea that all endings to a game are the same. Contrary to what Chris is saying here, these weren't random blog posts. This was Jesper Juul's master's thesis. Interactive fiction often downplays the game in relation to the frame. Jesper, no! Many of the narratologists who jumped into the conversation thereafter were directly responding to Juul. I don't think that it's accurate to say that this debate never actually happened. And this is what debate in academia looks like. It's just people writing papers about each other and subtweeting at most. E.J. Arseth is another famous ludologist, and he didn't just make the claim that narratological discourse or rhetoric was insufficient for talking about games. He said that to use any sort of language from literary studies or anything outside of game studies in the discussion of games was to commit academic colonialism, without question, the university is a colonial institution, but that wasn't what E.J. Arseth was arguing for. He was saying that to move any sort of ideas from one place in the academy to another place in the academy was to do colonialism. I think it's important to remember that video game studies wasn't like a language or cultural product from an oppressed group. Except gamers, the most oppressed group, rise up! I think Arseth's argument is alarmist, and it's kind of ignoring the forest for the trees. Film studies borrows a lot of the language from literary studies as well, and it's entirely its own autonomous thing, and I think that it's okay. There's going to be some exchange between different discourses, and video game studies is in its infancy or adolescence, so it's fine. It's all gonna be okay. Janet Murray has a little speech preview to a keynote that was delivered in a year. According to her, the reason the debate was so difficult to settle was that one side of the conversation was defining the whole thing. People like Juul and Arseth got to say, you guys are trying to destroy game studies, and we're trying to save it, so stop what you're doing, you're ruining everything. But academics like Juul and Arseth aren't unique to the field of game studies. What actually sets them and their colleagues in other departments and other fields apart from the rest of the fucking world is that they are formalists. They try to conduct analyses that look at the thing for its technical parts, and that's it. It's just mechanics or style or meter, and any attempt to extract stories from these games is an imposition on the discourse. Ludology, Murray says, is a neutral term. It's not an inherently formalistic approach to game studies. She argues that we can marry ludology and narratology. They were never meant to be mutually exclusive, and play and narrative can be studied together. We do it all the time. She agrees with me that the people who were being called ludologists at the time were probably more accurately referred to as game essentialists or video game formalists, computer game formalists, I think she says. Arseth and Juul, they weren't even 100% ludological in their thinking. Nobody can be either 100% narratological or 100% ludological. That's not how things work. Usually these logies are just names that describe general shared opinions between groups of people. It's not deterministic if you call yourself, feminist, for example. Humans are creatures of contradiction, and very few of us can claim to be hardcore whatever the fuck without being a little hypocritical or absurd, including Jesper Juul, who was a literature studies student. Talk about academic colonialism. Ooh. When I was in my last year of university, I wrote an essay on Shakespeare's most famous play, The Taming of the Shrew. The Taming of the Shrew is notoriously sexist, so I tried to look for the redeemable aspects of the play's female characters, and I wanted to make the argument that, maybe the bigger problem with the play is the way that it rewards the men who are abusive and awful in it, not just the fact that these female characters aren't, perfect. I thought I was being generous and clever, and I was. But when I got the paper back, my instructor had given me a mark that was way lower than anything I'd gotten before in my tenure at this university, and they did that because I used the word sexist to describe the play. They had recommended that I have some fun with it, talk about how funny it was, and to use less research. They also gave me really good marks when I focused strictly on meter and rhyme scheme, and when I talked about how the play was socially progressive in this millennia. In the 2000s. The reasoning was that to read into the politics of the text was to commit violence against the text. I'm not even joking or exaggerating, that was word for word what they said to me. That was my first encounter with a formalist in one of the supposed left-wing incubators of a university, an English department. Somebody tell the Lobster King. So when I watched Chris's video, I realized that our fundamental disagreement was about why this whole conversation about the debate that did or didn't happen is important. Yes, the way that we tend to evaluate the quality of games is obtuse and can be reductive at times. However, what's more important here is the way that the gaming community engages with mechanics. And I gotta say it, a lot of gamers are a lot like my Shakespeare instructor. Gamers like to be formalists. Dan Olson recently released a video on emergent narratives and colonialism in Minecraft. It's great, go watch it. I clearly can't get enough of his work since I've referenced him twice in this video. 5 minutes after it went live, I scrolled down through the comment section knowing exactly what I was going to find. Slimy slinguses were slipping into Dan's comments to tell him that he was overthinking it. Oh no! That his opinion is subjective and that the game's mechanics are objective. That reading colonialism into Minecraft was reading too much into it. That Mojang never meant for it to be that that way, so it wasn't that way. What interests me here is this claim that mechanics are objective, that the game is objective. Robert Cassar is another academic, ooh, and in his article entitled Gramsci in Games, he draws from Anita Sarkeesian, I'm just kidding, he draws from Antonio Gramsci, who is a really important and prominent Marxist scholar. Woo! Cassar thinks that games, like all art, like all culture, are subject to and the products of their social, political, economic, and religious moments. He says ideology has the capacity to manifest while seeming perfectly neutral. Case in point, Call of Duty Superman nearly always represents the mission of the American military as good and just. In order to progress, what do you gotta do? Shoot down your target. Who's your target? Well, the people who are marked by their otherness. What are those markers? Often brown skin and speaking anything but English? These mechanics are conveying ideas about what Americanness is, that Americanness is good, and that Americanness is an antibody to the pathogen obstacle that is bad non-Americanness. That is ideology. Ideological. Shit, that was supposed to be a powerful line! Cassar argues that video game players, like all audiences, are inundated with ideological content without realizing it. At the level of myth, historical notions become ideological truths, and history is transformed into nature. The point here is that even mechanics are expressive of some ideological base. That meaningfulness is mushed into the mechanics in the way that you interact with the game. The text is, on all levels, an ideological construct. It is created, and the ideas within it are held and created, and it's not natural, it's not objective, it's not a thing that you just pull out of the world and slap onto the ground like a piece of arsenic. So the debate did happen, and to say that it didn't is to inoculate formalists against further criticism. I was a little reductive when I explained Jesper Juul's stances earlier. I say this because Juul took to his blog to harumph and guffaw about the people who use the word formalist. He believes that people like me use it as a derogatory term to denote moral or political bankruptcy.
Did you mean virtue signaling?
We have to retread some ground here, because I'm anticipating certain criticisms, and I want to vacuum them up before they become dust in my carpet. I've chosen Juul and Arseth as my focus because they're probably cited the most out of all other ludologists. Yes, some ludologists did argue for the specialization of game studies. Sometimes. From Juul's perspective, little amateur upstarts like me probably seem like they're impetuous reactionaries, misunderstanding his earlier work like fucking yucky things. Unfortunately, when this debate was at its fieriest and sexiest, formalists were combining their analysis with weird purist gatekeeping based on logic that verged on the ridiculous. To give just one example, most of Juul's arguments about play rely on the existence of a universal experience. To say that players gradually come to ignore frame stories and focus on game structure, you'd have to assume that every player is exactly the same, surrounded by the same conditions, subject to the same forces and influences, that everybody thinks the same way. I want to emphasize that it's possible to look at the formal aspects of a work of art without diminishing the other approaches that people can take. Formalist frameworks can be conducive towards getting a grasp on the unique, distinctly gamey bits that are littered around the world like so many broken dreams. To be clear, I'm not diagnosing people with political bankruptism if they decide to write an essay that's like categorizing types of mechanics or something. What troubles me is that formalism enables and provides justification for people who like to say that you can read too much into something even as they miss the broader point. I was told I was committing violence against the taming of the shrew in an essay where I was largely exonerating the women within the play. We can't use art as a vehicle for talking about politics. Ignore that shit. Think about iambic pentameter. This random YouTube commenter chiming in with the smart boy observation that the conversation was wrong because villagers aren't people, and Juul suggesting that fiction dilutes interactivity, are difficult to differentiate from one another. They make room for predominantly conservative and elitist discussions around art analysis. The suggestion here is that there's no deeper meaning that we can glean from art, that there are schematically right and wrong ways to do art analysis. The right ways happen to be those which mysteriously discourage inspections of a thing's flaws that would illuminate power differentials outside the game. To borrow a phrase from Sarah Ahmed, there's a process of bracketing going on here. We can set aside things that are real and that do matter, but which are inconvenient in the moment. So for the record, I'm not calling Juul a racist or an imperialist or a transphobe or anything. I am saying, though, that formalism empowers people with poo-poo politics because it downplays the frame in relation to the game. Oh, boop-ba-doop-boop-boop-boop. I'm sorry, Jesper. You said that games can't have stories. This is your burden to bear for all time! While I was making my video on Control, A lot of my research led me to articles that argued for the value of looking at games through their narratives. There was one that I really liked by a guy named Marcus Shulzke argued that games were the most ethically and practically viable arenas within which we could play out philosophical thought experiments. That's pretty cool. So I think that looking into the politics that come out of mechanics is fruitful, if for no other reason than we can just do thought experiments, and it's really fun and pretentious and nice and good, and that's nice. I contend, though, that appositional play, the term I coined for the thing I noticed, will make everybody shut up. Appositional play, for those of you who didn't catch my last video, arises out of game narratives wherein the player is implicated in the actions of the player character when they're either conflated to the player character, or when the boundary between the player and the player character is blurred. The result is an amalgamation between the two while they are at once held at a remove. Appositional play facilitates an emergent narrative between the player and the game itself, and that forces the player to confront the possibility that their participation in the game world might actually rob another character of their agency or result in the sacrifice of the players. The beauty of this thing is that it kind of highlights that all play involves some sort of erasure between those two figures. Here's my point, okay? If we pretend that games aren't ideological, or that we can somehow sterilize them or shield them against the politics that are surrounding them as they're being created, it doesn't even matter. The progression of game narratives relies on the player conceding at least a little bit to the politics that the game world is presenting to them. The political landscape of video games is changed and influenced by the player being in there and agreeing to participate. Okay, Juul contends with this idea that storytelling and play happen simultaneously, that story is an interruption of play. When something is interactive, the interactivity has to be now, when the player makes a choice. The computer action game is based on real time, on the constant control of the player. Control again? Waha! You thought this video was completely unrelated to the last one. So let's think about this in the context of Judith and BioShock. Does our interaction with the game contribute to the telling of the narrative in real time? Constantly? I would say yeah. The protagonists' identities are really confusing because of the presence of the player. But because of the point that these games are trying to make, I don't think that the points where we don't have control are actually interruptions. Inaction is a type of interaction. You don't have to be moving around and being engaged, right? Juul did get me thinking about this issue from a different angle. In discussing Space War, which he describes as not bad, ideological, he talks about how the game usually has two players, each controlling a spaceship while it circles a planet. That's all it took to get me thinking about shared control, when there are multiple players interacting with the game together, or when one player is allied with AI. So there's this game called Never Alone, right? And you can have a buddy pick up and play that little fox character if they want to. Whether there are one or two players involved, though, death has the exact same consequences. If either character falls off a cliff or something, including the one that player one isn't controlling, you have to restart that fucking portion of the level. Furthermore, progressing through the game unlocks educational videos by Indigenous people that teach about Indigenous culture. Initially, I thought of this part of the game as a comparatively passive element, and I was frustrated by having to restart a level because of the artificial intelligence that doesn't know how to jump! That seems like the opposite of constant control, but maybe interactivity, the kind that's not bad, is, here I go, ideological! Maybe I value that because of my context and my culture. Inupiaq people might say that listening and learning to the teachings of your elders so that you can go and pass it on to the next generation is a pretty engaging form of interaction, and control might not factor into that matter so much as mutuality might. In Never Alone, yeah, you're the player, but your AI fox is part of your team. You're a fucking cute-ass duo. And you can't just keep going alone. That would contradict the title of the game. Maybe the reason that Jesper and I center our discussions around play on control is because of something ideological around us that's been elevated to the realm of myth. My point, though, is that appositionality doesn't have to be spookifying or scary. Oh. It can be a way to highlight the player's role in the community. And that's kind of beautiful to think about, isn't it? Hey, horror fans unite! Subscribe to this channel for more eerie tales of blood, probably, and share this video with your friends who are as scary as you are. Goodbye!